Howdy guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of ND filters for your drone, or neutral density filters. ND filters are essentially a pair of sunglasses for your drone. Just as you would wear a pair of sunglasses on a bright day if in real life, you would put an ND filter on your drone on a bright day if you were flying. Now going back to what I've talked about before, remember you always want your shutter speed of your drone to be double the frame rate. So since I typically film at 60 FPS, I always want my shutter speed to be 120. In addition to this, you always want your ISO to be set as low as possible, as the higher the ISO, the more chance of noise in your film. So knowing this, on bright days, if you didn't have a filter on your drone and you went to manual camera settings and you set your shutter speed to 120 and your ISO as low as possible, the image is still most likely going to be very washed out. As we can see here, I didn't have a filter on the drone, but I set the parameters to what it needed to be, and overall it was just super bright. You couldn't make out any details. And looking at the histogram and the exposure values, you can see it's way too high. So this is when putting on a filter comes into play. Putting on the correct filter is kind of a guessing game. Typically, you can use ND4 for, early morning or evening films before the sun goes down, ND8 for a cloudy day, ND16 for a sunny day, and then ND32 or higher if you're like over a lake, snow, or something where there's a lot of reflections. Now, there are a few apps on the App Store that are a little bit out of date, but if you enter in what your ISO is set to, what your shutter speed is set to, and then still how overexposed the camera is, it'll kind of calculate what filter you need. But again, it's typically, I always go for an ND8 or ND16 filter depending on how cloudy it is outside, and typically that works very well. So you can see here, I'm putting on a filter. It's very easy on the Mavic Air 2. You just twist off the original filter and then twist back on, and you'll hear almost a little click, and your filter is back on, easy as that. Flying with the filter, it has a lot of advantages. Most importantly, it's like a pair of sunglasses. It filters out a lot of light, so your shutter speed and ISO can be at a value it should be to make the motion blur of the photo and video natural. As the more natural the footage looks, the better footage you're going to have. In addition to this, better filters oftentimes bring out more color depth of lenses, as an overexposed shots looks way oversaturated and all the colors look dull. However, if you get the saturation on correctly, you're going to find the colors look a lot more vibrant, and it makes post-color correction a lot easier, as you already have a fantastic baseline to your photos. So overall, ND filters are essentially just a pair of sunglasses for your drones that are worth their weight in gold. Now that we've talked about why you need to use ND filters and kind of what ND filter you should use for various light conditions, and again, ND4 I typically use for early morning or late evening, but when it's still a little bit bright outside. ND8 is great for a cloudy day. ND16 is good for a sunny day, but not over water or snow or something that's reflective. And then ND32 or higher is fantastic for a bright, sunny day that also has a lot of reflections either off water, snow, or like a metal building or something. But again, that's just kind of play around with it. Most importantly, always manually set your camera and do double your shutter speed. So if you're filming in 60 FPS, set your shutter speed to 120. If you're filming in 30 FPS, set it to 60, and so on and so forth, depending on your frame rate. And then ISO always as low as possible. Don't overdo it. Don't put an ND64 filter on if it's a cloudy day and then have to set the ISO up to 400 to 800. That's going to bring a lot of noise into your footage and end up doing the opposite of what we want ND filters to do. Now that we have talked about how to use them and when to use them, let's talk about what type to buy, because there's a lot of debate over why you should buy polarized or why you should buy non-polarized ND filters, and from what I've learned, I very much prefer non-polarized ND filters. Just as with polarized sunglasses, adding a polarization effect eliminates a lot of reflections, and although this might sound like a good thing, sometimes you can use reflections to your advantage. Adding on a polarized filter will oftentimes do counterproductive things, as it'll make the shot look dull. There won't be any natural lens flare, reflections off the lake, and so I always prefer just normal neutral density filters that are unpolarized. However, each have their advantages in certain regards. If you are filming on a very bright sunny day over a lake and you don't want the reflections off the water, you want everything to look uniform, you don't want to be able to see the sun reflecting off the lake, a polarized filter is great. And I do have both non-polarized and polarized filters for my drone, and it kind of just depends on what style I want. Now just remember, polarized filters are going to cut out a lot of the reflections. It's going to make everything look flatter. There's not really going to be many like sun rays or sun reflections off the water, where a normal ND filter, so meaning it's non-polarized, is just going to reduce the amount of light, but it's essentially going to look the same as the human eye sees it. Now, talking about the filters I use, personally I use a brand that's spelled Neewer. I believe it's pronounced Neewer, and it's a brand of filters I've been using back on my Phantom 4. I now have a set for the Mavic Air 2. It'll be linked in the description below. I bought the Flymore combo, so the filter set that came with it came with an ND 16, 64, and 256. I've never seen really application for the 64 and 256. I know specifically the 256 is meant for long exposure photos, so if you want, like light streaking, I'll kind of show a picture of like a long exposure here. No, I didn't take it, but this is kind of what long exposure looks like. But DJI included 16, 64, and 256, which I've always thought was a little bit of a weird choice by them. So I had to buy a set of filters, and it came with 4, 8, and 16. Again, 4 used for early morning, 8 used for a cloudy day, 16 is most commonly what I use. And overall, I really like that brand. I also like this brand of ND filters as they're super light. You don't want to get a pair of cheap filters that weigh a lot more than the camera's lens, and so it adds strain on the gimbal, which is going to make the gimbal speed slower and could possibly damage the drone and gimbal. And the camera is the expensive part of the drone, so you don't want to be messing around with a pair of poor filters. So, these were only 30 bucks. They've lasted me well. They've done awesome, and overall, I really, really like these filters. So it's not really, of course, I'm not sponsored by them, but if you want a good pair of filters, I'd recommend them. In conclusion, today we talked about what filters to use, when to use them, and how to properly apply them. So remember, you always want to manually lock in your camera settings. You want double the shutter speed to your frame rate, and you want as low of an ISO as possible. Go ahead, I typically turn on the drone, set those parameters, see how overexposed it is, and then turn it back off, put on a filter, and then typically you're good there. The more experience you get using filters, you're kind of able to guess what filter you need before even having to turn on the drone, and you can just clip it on. Quick word, do not put on a filter while the drone's on. When the gimbal's trying to stabilize, if you're touching the camera and moving it, it could burn out the motor, so only remove and put on filters when the drone is completely powered off and the gimbal will move freely as you move it. I'd like to thank you guys all for watching this video. A little bit something different. I know is kind of a little bit different than what we typically talk about. But filters are super important. I use them every flight, and I figured it was just worth kind of explaining my thought process on which filter I use for which days, which scenarios, and so on and so forth, and what I bought. And so overall, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.